At the time of Ian's death, Joy Division were riding high as arguably one of the biggest bands in the country. With help from producer Martin Hannett, they had released their debut album Unknown Pleasures in 1979. They had appeared on national television and were on the verge of a US tour, which ultimately, of course, never happened. Joy Division stand as one of the most intriguing what-if bands. Who knows what that intensely creative and passionate mind could have conjured up next? By the end of the 70s, the English punk scene was fading. Determined not to fade away with it, Joy Division carved out an entirely new niche. The band formed in Salford in 1976, after Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook were inspired by a Sex Pistols show at the Manchester Lesser Free Trade Hall. For them, that gig completely obliterated their idea of what a pop star is. Musicians were no longer people to worship. Sex Pistols had brought it back down to earth, made it accessible and raw. The day after the gig, Peter Hook borrowed £35 from his mum to buy a bass guitar, and Sumner bought a guitar. After auditioning a slew of drummers, they finally settled on Stephen Morris. All they needed now was a vocalist, so they put an ad up in the Manchester Virgin record shop, and it caught the attention of Ian Curtis. He was hired without an audition, mainly because Sumner knew he was alright to get on with. With that, Warsaw was born, after a brief existence as Stiff Kittens. To begin with, Curtis and the band would take inspiration from David Bowie, attempting to squeeze the essence of the album low through a punk filter. In fact, their name was directly inspired by a David Bowie track. Curtis was easily influenced by his musical heroes, most notably the drug-fueled antics of Iggy Pop. He was even inspired as a teenager by Iggy Pop to experiment with drugs, and so he would steal medication from the care home he was volunteering at. This led to him having his stomach pumped at the age of just 16. Back to Warsaw though, their first attempts of music were laughed at by the Manchester punks of the 70s. They were quite frankly fed up of bands popping up overnight trying to copycat the success of the Sex Pistols. So Curtis changed direction, exercised his incredibly poignant and creative mind, and started writing about what he knew. And the things he knew were the streets of Macclesfield, channeling a voice most young people growing up on council estates could relate to. He also wrote about his experience working at a job centre. His favourite client dying from an epileptic fit would inspire She's Lost Control. Perhaps most importantly, he knew writers too, the themes of which would bleed their way into Curtis's lyrics over time. Interzone and The Atrocity Exhibition were lifted from William Burroughs and J.G. Ballard, respectively. Deborah Curtis would later say that Ian didn't have an unhappy childhood. Nothing horrible happened. He didn't have a lot to draw on. I think that's why he read so much. He also had a great interest in existentialism, writers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Franz Kafka, and Dostoevsky. He also connected deeply with the prose of Oscar Wilde. He also had a fascination with pretty dark subjects: war, death, injury, self-mutilation.
I got hold of the original file that he'd had in his bedroom at Victoria Park Flats. I was shocked to see that the writing was almost as depressing as what he'd written later on, and that was from when he was 16, talking about how bad the world was. I mean, that's the sort of thing 16-year-old boys do anyway, I think, but he didn't grow out of it. It just got worse.
The name Joy Division comes from the novella House of Dolls. It's a story about women who were kept alive in concentration camps purely for the sexual gratification of German soldiers. These women were the Joy Divisions. Suddenly, the name of the band doesn't seem so peachy, right? But like I said, from a young age, Curtis was fascinated by this darker side of existence. He had a love for it all. And this is all talked about, by the way, in Deborah Curtis's book, Touching from a Distance. I'll pop a link to it down below if you fancy buying it and reading it for yourself. The point is, Ian started drawing on these influences in his songwriting, albeit subconsciously. Curtis always said in interviews that what he wrote was always up for interpretation. He would never consciously allow himself to be influenced by a certain writer. The true meaning of a song wouldn't be obvious. He wanted it to be an intellectual pursuit for the listener. He'd often talk about the band's songwriting process as well, which wasn't exactly ordinary. You see, Curtis had a little notebook full of thoughts, musings, ideas, and the band would simply jam together until they found a riff or a melody that Ian could fit one of these lyrics into. And then the song would develop from there, in most cases anyway. After adopting this new way of writing, the band caught the attention of Tony Wilson and Rob Gretton. Wilson signed them to his independent label, Factory Records, and Gretton became the group's manager. Warsaw became Joy Division, and soon Martin Hannett would help to pin down Joy Division's definitive haunting sound. He would work with Curtis's lyrics and dark disposition to define Joy Division and produce Unknown Pleasures. The release of this album allowed the members of the band to quit their day jobs. They were becoming bona fide rock stars. Tours, albums, money, it was all on the horizon for them. But for Curtis, all of this served as fuel for his anxiety. You see, in 1979, just a couple of months before the release of the album, Curtis became a father with his wife of 4 years, Deborah. A daughter that he couldn't even hold, because in the same year he was diagnosed with severe epilepsy, and he couldn't hold his daughter for the fear of an epileptic attack. The medication for his epilepsy had a number of side effects, which included extreme mood swings. While recording their second album, Closer, Ian was experiencing 1 or 2 seizures per week. It was a difficult time for the band.
Ian's illness was degenerative, and it was getting worse. The big problem with Ian was that he never wanted to upset you. He was very empathic to other people. He would go out of his way to make sure that you felt all right about what he was suffering.
Curtis even suffered 2 on-stage seizures on the same day. In April of 1980, Curtis suffered a seizure on stage at Finsbury Park. The lighting technician accidentally switched on a strobe light in the middle of their set, which caused the attack. Despite this, Curtis was adamant that the band play their next commitment in West Hampstead later that same day. Unfortunately, again during the set, Curtis suffered another attack of epilepsy. This time, it was the most violent he had endured so far. His condition had a devastating effect on his already less than ideal mental health. He drank, smoked, and slept irregularly. And despite first being open to discussing his condition, he quickly became withdrawn and refused to speak about the complexities of it. According to Peter Hook, Curtis would tell his bandmates what they wanted to hear, insisting on not concerning them.
You know, he managed to hide it well enough from his parents, from the doctors that he was being treated by. The guy wanted success. He wanted us to achieve what he felt we deserved. And he hid it, and that was the problem. He would never let you know how poorly he was. So you were in ignorance, even when you were picking him up off the floor when he smashed his head open in the sink in the toilet.
In 1979, Curtis started an affair with Annick Honoré. She had worked in London's Belgian embassy before switching careers as a music journalist and promoter. The two met at a gig in Brussels. Honoré insisted that their relationship was never sexual. Curtis initially attempted suicide on the 6th of April 1980 by an overdose. While recuperating with Tony Wilson in his cottage in Derbyshire, he sent a number of love letters to Honoré. And in 1980, Deborah filed for divorce after Curtis failed to cut all contact with Annick. So now, as well as a father and a husband, he was expected to be a rock star, a creative, a pioneer in songwriting. He was responsible now for the livelihoods of Joy Division's other members, and he was juggling all of this with his condition of epilepsy and severe mental health issues. I mean, he was 23. Let that sink in, 23 years old. He was still a kid. While the success of the band was exciting and something Ian wanted, it also came with a whole lot of dread. The dread of more public epilepsy attacks. The dread of his marriage breaking down even further with long-distance arguments over the phone. The dread of being estranged from his daughter. And the dread of his darker thoughts becoming publicly scrutinized in his lyrics. In May 1980, with divorce proceedings inevitable, Curtis hung himself with a washing line in his home. Love had torn him apart. So let's look in detail at Love Will Tear Us Apart and how it could be a posthumous message from Ian Curtis revealing his mental turmoil. The track was recorded in March of 1980 and released in June of the same year, the month after his suicide. It's quite unlike other Joy Division tracks. It was written really as a bridge between Unknown Pleasures and Closer. Peter Hook once told Gigwise, "I think Love Will Tear Us Apart is a very poppy, very commercial, I suppose you'd say, riff. It's very memorable. The thing is, that allied to the very dark lyrics in the song, I suppose it makes it very bittersweet." He continued, "It's quite a frightening song lyrically. It's completely at odds with the music. I think that's very Joy Division, actually. It sort of lulls you into a false sense of bonhomie, and then rips your heart out." On the surface, it seems that Curtis is writing about the deterioration of his marriage. "Why is the bedroom so cold you've turned away on your side," as the lyrics go. It became apparent, though, after his death, that there's a much darker meaning to these lyrics. What do those words mean? Love will tear us apart. Peter Hook wrote in his book, A Poetic, Sensitive, Tortured Soul, the Ian Curtis of the myth. He was definitely that. But he could also be one of the lads. He had 3 personas he was trying to juggle. He had his married man persona, at home with the wife, the laddish side, and the cerebral, literary side. Sumner wrote, "Strange as it may sound, it wasn't until after his death that we really listened to Ian's lyrics and clearly heard the inner turmoil in them. It was hard for anyone close to Ian to truly know what he was going through. He had multiple personas, as Hook says. How could anyone know they were talking to the real Ian Curtis? As it turned out, that privilege was reserved for the listeners. His true feelings were revealed only in his lyrics. His fans would have a deeper, more intimate relationship with him than his family, his friends, his wife even. The lyrics were so dark, so very dark. You just think, how come he couldn't talk to somebody about it?" Deborah would later say. I think the word love here can have many meanings. Again, remember, Curtis always left things to interpretation. Love could refer to the love that Curtis had for Deborah or Anique. But perhaps it could also be the love that he had for his art. And with that love, with the success of Joy Division comes all the pressures of being a rock star that eventually tore him apart. And then that phrase, tear us apart, is he talking about him being torn apart by Deborah? Or is he talking about himself and his multiple personalities? U2's Bono once said, when he got behind the microphone, he really surged forth. There was another energy. It seemed like he was just 2 people. And, Love Will Tear Us Apart, it was like when that record was released, it was like as if there were the personalities. Separate. There they were, torn apart. Perhaps even he's talking directly to the listener. Love, whatever that may be, has torn him apart from his fans with his suicide. We also know that Curtis had a love and a fascination for the darker things in life. Death, destruction. And of course with that comes a bit of a social stigma. Was his fascination with the darker side of reality eventually too much for him to handle? Additionally, his influences in media seemed to refer to early death and youth suicide. For example, David Bowie's All the Young Dudes and Rock and Roll Suicide. Curtis was also a huge fan of The Doors. You can hear Jim Morrison's vocal influence on Ian's performances. And of course, Morrison died young, at the age of 27. When Curtis was found, Iggy Pop's record, The Idiot, was on the turntable. On that album is the song Tiny Girls, with the lyrics, "Well, the day begins, you don't want to live, 'cause you can't believe in the one you're with." The last film he watched, the evening before his death, was Werner Herzog's Strozzek, whose hero, a musician, shoots himself after travelling hopefully to America only to be betrayed by his girlfriend. All of this has pointed some people to believe that Curtis actually, in some way, scripted his own death. The idea that there had been some sort of intertextuality between his death and the media he'd been absorbing. Did Curtis plan his own death for the sake of his art? To give more meaning and more poignancy to the songs that followed his death? Take a look at the imagery plastered all over Closer and Love Will Tear Us Apart. Tombs, weeping angels, gravestones. These were images that Curtis, along with the rest of the band, chose. Peter Saville, who designed the artwork, would later reflect on this. The unsettling thing is wondering what was in his mind. I showed them photographs of a cemetery, while the quiet writer was penning the closest thing to a suicide note you can possibly get. It's a morbid thought, obviously, that Curtis planned all of this for his artistic expression, but again, he left everything to interpretation. And is suicide not the ultimate expression of ambiguity? As Peter Hook explains, it leaves everyone wondering.
And that's the beauty of suicide, isn't it? It's not them that are worrying afterwards. It's everybody else about who, when, or why.
Death is a great price to pay, and life is very dear to all. Oscar Wilde wrote this in 1888 in The Nightingale and the Rose, the story about a nightingale who sacrifices her life in the name of love. It seems only in his sacrifice, whether intentionally or not, do we as listeners get to acknowledge the true beauty, sorrow, and ambiguity that was Ian Curtis. So, as it is open to interpretation, what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. If you are suffering with anything mentioned in this video, please take a look at the description down below. There are links to services there that can and will help you. Now, another death that shook the world in 1980 was that of John Lennon. Did you know, though, that Paul McCartney believes John made one last connection to him from beyond the grave in a song that left him weeping uncontrollably? Click over here to watch that one next.